Let's start with something simple. Imagine you're holding an old wooden chest, dusty, heavy, the kind you see in movies about treasure hunts. Now picture it opening with a slow creak. Inside, there's not gold, not jewels, but a small lump of iron, cold, black, and scarred with age. This is no ordinary piece of metal. It's a seal, the kind used to stamp wax on documents centuries ago. Back then, this was like a signature, a guarantee, a way of saying, this comes with power. Today, you might think of it like a CEO's signature on a billion-dollar deal, or the official stamp on a passport. Except, this one carried whispers of something darker. Why darker? Because legend says this seal wasn't just for contracts between men. It was for a pact between the Pope himself and someone no one in medieval Europe dared name out loud,
Have
the
faith,
devil.
my children.
Now before you
Do
roll
not
your
let
eyes,
the darkness
think about
consume
it.
you.
The Middle
We will
Ages were
pray
full
for
of fear.
salvation.
People believed evil could hide in any corner, that demons could slip into the cracks of daily life. A pope, supposed to be the most holy man on earth, holding a seal tied to the devil. That idea shook the ground beneath the faithful. And yet, in dusty monastery records, in the margins of half-burned letters, you find small hints, scribbles about a sigillum ferium, the iron seal, always mentioned with a warning, always in whispers, as if even writing the words was dangerous. So here's the question. Was it just a story to scare people? Or was there really a seal that marked a forbidden pact? Tonight, let's pull at that thread together. When you step into the dusty libraries of medieval Europe, the first thing that strikes you isn't the silence, but the smell. Old parchment, wax, and ink that has faded to a brownish ghost of itself. Among these shelves, monks scribbled notes in the margins, tiny warnings that few were meant to read. And in those notes, scattered across France, Italy, and even Spain, you find whispers of something they dared to call the Iron Seal. Most of these manuscripts are mutilated. Entire lines have been scraped clean with a knife, the vellum thinned until light passes through it. In some, the words are violently crossed out, leaving only a suggestion. Sigillum ferum, the Iron Seal. Why erase a name if it meant nothing? The medieval mind lived in fear. Fear of plague that wiped out half a village overnight. Fear of witches whose curses seemed more real than the sermons from the pulpit. Fear of demons waiting in the shadows of their homes. So when someone hinted that the Pope himself might have touched a seal connected to the devil, it was almost too much to bear. But here's the strange part.
A ring.
In the letters of one
with
Italian
claws.
abbot, he describes receiving an order from Rome. An order to destroy a ring of iron marked with claws. He never explains further, but his words trail off as if he realized someone else might read them. A week later, the abbey records note that this same abbot was found dead in his chamber. The cause? A sudden choking, as though seized by invisible hands. Coincidence or a warning? As the monks copied these fragments, some added cryptic marks, small serpent shapes curling through the margins, as if telling future readers, pay attention, there is more here than meets the eye. And that raises a chilling question. If the Iron Seal was real, who dared to craft it? Was it a symbol of papal authority turned dark? Or something older, far more dangerous, smuggled into Christendom under the guise of faith? We aren't answering that yet. But as you listen, I want you to imagine those monks hunched over their desks, scratching away by candlelight, pausing whenever the wind rattled the shutters. Because they weren't just writing history. They were trying to hide something. Something the Vatican didn't want spoken aloud. Because there's a letter. Not just any letter, but one attributed to Pope Clement V, written at the height of the Templar trials. The Vatican archives don't display it, of course, but fragments survive in the notes of a notary who copied legal records in Avignon. And in those fragments, a single chilling phrase stands out: sigillum ferrum ad pactum servandum. The iron seal to keep the pact. Now let's stop for a second. A pact with who? A pact about what? The Church thrived on oaths and seals, yes, but those seals were made of gold, silver, or wax, never iron. Iron belonged to shackles, weapons, cages. In medieval thought, iron was the metal of blood and punishment, not of divine authority. And yet here it was, tied to the hand of the Pope himself. Some historians dismiss this as metaphor, saying iron only symbolized strength or permanence. But the notary's copy is precise. He even drew a crude sketch in the margin, a round disc, etched with a serpent coiling around a cross. That image doesn't feel symbolic. It feels real. Even more troubling, the notary adds a note that the seal was brought from the east, forged in the shadow of Solomon's temple. That pushes the story back centuries, tying it not only to the Templars, but to the holy ground they once guarded. So let's imagine this together. You're in Avignon, 1308. The Templars are being dragged into trials, forced to confess to blasphemies under torture. In the middle of it all, a sealed chest is carried into the Pope's residence. Guards don't look inside. They don't dare. And within it lies the iron seal, heavy and cold, a relic no one is supposed to touch, because touching it might mean more than sealing a decree. It might mean sealing yourself. Was the Pope its guardian, its prisoner, or something far stranger? What makes this more unnerving is the pattern. Every time the seal is mentioned in surviving notes, it's followed by sudden silences, missing pages, erased lines, scribes disappearing from the record. It's as though the iron seal didn't just exist on paper. It reached out, erased, and punished those who got too close. And that's the thread we'll pull next. Because as we move deeper, the question won't just be about whether the Pope held the seal, but what the seal demanded in return. Imagine the Pope's chamber lit by nothing but oil lamps. The air is thick with smoke, the scent of burning resin masking something sharper, almost metallic. On his desk sits the seal, its iron surface catching the light with a dull gleam, as though it swallows more than it reflects. And here's where the legends diverge. Some say Clement V never touched it with his bare hands, always through a cloth, always with whispered prayers, as if the object itself were listening. Others suggest he pressed it against documents that had nothing to do with law or faith, but everything to do with submission. Not submission to God, submission to something older. A 14th century monk wrote that the seal was fed. His words are vague but chilling. Fed how? With ink, with wax, or if the darker rumors are true, with drops of blood. A pope sealing decrees not with a flourish of pen, but with the quiet sting of his own vein. It's hard to know what's exaggeration and what's fact. But here's what stands out. Every time the seal was invoked, power shifted. Bishops who opposed Clement suddenly fell silent. Kings who once bristled at Rome's authority found themselves strangely compliant. And yet, in the shadows, the Templars themselves whispered that the Pope was no longer acting of his own will. Think about that. The most powerful spiritual leader in Christendom? Reduced to a custodian of iron? If true, it flips everything we assume about who controlled the trials, who truly wanted the Templars destroyed. Because if Clement wasn't steering the wheel, then maybe the seal was. And that's where the story sharpens. What if the pact wasn't about alliance, but about surrender? What if the Vatican's greatest authority was bound not by faith, but by fear of a relic that demanded obedience? This is the moment in our journey where the seal stops being an artifact and becomes a character. Silent, yes, but active. And in the next chapter, as we follow its trail through the interrogations and betrayals, you'll see how it left fingerprints on history that no amount of official rewriting could ever hide. Picture this for a moment. The year is 1307. The chill of autumn hangs over Paris, and inside the dim stone hall of the royal palace, a trial is about to begin. Rows of benches creak under the weight of clerics, notaries, and a handful of curious nobles who've come to watch. At the center, shackled and weary, kneel the Knights Templar, men who once rode like thunder across battlefields, now reduced to trembling shadows under torchlight. But here's what no one tells you in the schoolbook version of this story. Every parchment, every accusation, every oath sworn that day bore the impression of the same strange insignia, an iron seal pressed deep into wax. Its design? Not the familiar cross of Christ, but something coiled, twisting, almost serpentine. Witnesses swore it shimmered faintly when the candles flickered, as though the metal itself carried a pulse. When the notaries read the charges, the room stiffened. The words sounded rehearsed, almost too uniform. Each knight, from different regions, supposedly confessed to the same bizarre rituals, spitting on the cross, worshipping a severed head, whispering oaths in darkness. How could men who never met in private all share the same script? Some whispered it was torture. Others, more quietly, believed the seal had carried those words into their mouths, like venom through a vein. And here's where it gets even stranger. The original records, the very manuscripts sealed by iron, still exist in fragments today, stored away in Vatican vaults. Scholars argue they are just routine papal documents. But if you compare them, line by line, the phrasing repeats with a rhythm too uncanny, too deliberate, almost like a chant. Could it be that what was written wasn't dictated by human hands alone? The Templars themselves seem to sense it. One chronicler describes a knight staring at the seal on the parchment as though it were alive. He refused to sign, saying, "That thing already knows my answer." Hours later, he was dragged out and never seen again. So let's pause here. Was this simply the machinery of politics? Or was the iron seal, the so-called pact itself, at work behind the scenes, shaping reality with ink and wax? Either way, the trials weren't just legal proceedings. They became a theater where fear itself was scripted, and the seal was the silent playwright. Step outside the palace walls for a moment. Imagine the narrow streets of Paris in 1307, muddy cobblestones slick with rain, torches sputtering in the mist, and whispers carrying faster than the wind. The people of the city didn't sit inside the trial, but they heard the verdicts long before they were read. Word spread from market stalls to taverns, from cathedral steps to dockside piers. The Templars had turned against Christ. But where did these whispers really come from? Not from witnesses, not from knights themselves, but from the same sealed parchments read aloud in the courtroom. It was as if the iron seal wasn't content with the stone walls of the palace. Its words bled outward, shaping the gossip of bakers, merchants, and even children who repeated fragments of accusations like nursery rhymes. And the stories grew stranger with each retelling. Some claimed the knights worshipped a black idol with glowing eyes. Others said they kissed each other's spines in darkened chapels. One rumor even insisted that under their white cloaks, the knights bore serpentine scars, a mark of their unholy pact. Here's what strikes me as odd. Medieval Europe was filled with heresy trials, yet none carried the same eerie uniformity as this one. The confessions weren't just shocking. They were theatrical, crafted to be unforgettable. Almost as though someone, or something, wanted the people themselves to become the jury long before the sentences were passed. There's a passage from a Parisian chronicler worth noting. He describes walking past the Cathedral of Notre Dame the day after the first confessions were announced. A crowd had gathered, staring not at the church doors, but at a scrap of parchment nailed to the wall, bearing the iron seal. He writes, "The wax shimmered, though no torch touched it. The people stared as if it had spoken to them, though no word was written beyond the charges. So ask yourself, how does fear spread? Through fact or through symbol?" In 1307, the iron seal became both, a weapon sharper than any sword, carving terror directly into the hearts of the faithful. And in that fear, the Vatican found exactly what it needed: a public already convinced, already eager for punishment, before any trial could be fairly finished. Inside the damp cells of Paris, the Templars waited. These were men who once commanded armies, who had ridden beneath blazing suns in the Holy Land. Yet here they were reduced to shadows, cloaks torn, hands shackled, and eyes searching for answers no one dared to speak aloud. At first, they reassured each other. "Hold fast," whispered one. "The truth will save us." But as the days turned into weeks, the cracks began to show. Some knights swore they had seen the iron seal glowing faintly in the torchlight during interrogations, as if it carried a power beyond ink and wax. One, trembling, admitted he dreamed of a serpent coiling around his chest at night, whispering that their brotherhood was already lost. Another claimed he heard chanting in the corridors, Latin words twisted into something unholy. Though no guard was there, the strongest knights began to doubt the weakest, and the weakest began to wonder if the accusations had planted something real inside them. Was it possible, they asked in hushed tones, that unknowingly the order had been touched by darkness? Could years of secret rites and whispered prayers have hidden meanings they had never truly understood? This paranoia was exactly what their enemies wanted. But what unsettles me most is how naturally it spread. No torture was required for doubt to sink in. Only silence, darkness, and the echo of a sealed accusation. A letter survives from one Templar imprisoned in the Tower of Chinon. In it he writes, "I do not fear the chains nor the fire. I fear the shadow that follows us now, though I cannot name it. It is as though something has been loosed, and it walks between us." Think about that. A soldier who had faced Saracen blades and siege engines now confessed to fearing something invisible, born not from battle, but from a document pressed with wax. And so the order's greatest weapon, unity, began to crumble. Not from swords, not from armies, but from whispers, dreams, and a creeping sense that perhaps the devil's hand was already inside their ranks. If fear is a seed, betrayal is the hand that waters it. The Vatican understood this well. Pope Clement's advisors whispered that no fortress could withstand doubt, and no oath was unbreakable when a man feared for his own life. So they sent not armies, but messengers cloaked in secrecy, confessors, informants, and spies who moved like smoke through the cracks of the Templar prisons. Some came offering hope. "Confess," they told the weary knights, and you will be spared the fire. Others came with threats, promising torment unless they repeated the words Rome wanted written down. And then there were those who came with lies, whispering that brothers in neighboring cells had already confessed, already betrayed them, already named names. You can imagine the effect. Alone in the dark, a knight would wonder if the man he had once trusted on the battlefield was now writing his name into the devil's ledger. Loyalty wavered. Secrets leaked. A single whispered admission in one cell was carried to another, twisted and amplified, until rumor sounded like truth. The Vatican's most dangerous weapon was not the rack or the flame, it was paper. Interrogators carefully recorded every broken confession, sealing each with the iron seal. What had begun as accusation became fact, and what was fact soon became history. One chronicler describes how a captain of the order, after weeks of silence, finally spoke, not because he believed the charges, but because he believed his silence would doom his men. "If lies are to be written," he is said to have muttered, "better they are mine than theirs." Imagine that. A man willing to stain his own soul to shield others from suffering. Yet, in the eyes of the Vatican, his words were not sacrifice, they were proof. And it worked. With every signature, every trembling mark of the quill, the order's unity unraveled. What began as whispers of doubt became voices of betrayal, until even those who had never confessed were painted with the same brush. By the time the records were sent to Clement's court, the story had already been shaped. The Templars, once protectors of Christendom, were now recorded as servants of darkness. Not because it was true, but because enough of them, broken, beaten, afraid, had spoken words that Rome could use. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. Once written, lies can live longer than truth. Outside the prison walls, the world of the Templars was changing just as quickly. Castles that had once stood as symbols of power now stood as silent targets. Markets that once welcomed them now turned away in suspicion. The Order's banner, once a mark of protection, began to feel like a curse. News of the arrests spread faster than fire through dry fields. In France, villagers whispered of knights dragged from their beds. In England, merchants wondered if their debts to the temple would vanish with the king's pen. And in Spain, even allies asked, if Rome calls them heretics, who are we to say otherwise? But not all bowed to fear. Some Templars who remained free gathered quietly in remote strongholds. They sent secret riders across mountains, carrying messages in code, pledges of loyalty, warnings of betrayal, desperate plans for survival. They still believed, or perhaps forced themselves to believe, that truth would prevail if they stood together. Imagine them for a moment. A handful of knights seated around a rough oak table in a candlelit hall. Maps unrolled before them, their edges curling in the damp. Their fingers trace the roads of Europe, the coasts of the Mediterranean, the ports of the Holy Land. Every line whispers the same question. Where can we run, if even the Church calls for our end? The answer was bitter. No fortress could withstand an enemy as vast as rumor. No treasury could buy protection when the Pope's word turned kings into hunters. The Templars had built their power on faith, and now that faith itself was the weapon used against them. Still, they did not surrender easily. They fortified their castles, trained their men, and swore to hold their oaths until the very end. Some believed they could wait out the storm, that Rome's anger would burn itself out. Others spoke of moving their wealth, their relics, their secrets, to places where no king's writ could reach. And all the while, behind every closed door, there was another fear. Not of the Vatican, but of betrayal from within. The same doubt that had broken men in prison now seeped into councils of the free. Who could they trust? Which messenger carried truth, and which carried the Vatican's poison? It was here, in this moment of uncertainty, that the Templar world truly began to fracture. Not on the battlefield, not at the stake, but in the silence between their own walls. The Pope's prisons may have held their leaders, but the Order's treasures were never so easy to cage. From the moment the arrests began, whispers told of wagons slipping out under moonlight, guarded by cloaked riders who spoke to no one. In Paris, witnesses swore they saw long convoys heading toward the River Seine, only to vanish before reaching the ports. What were they carrying? Gold, perhaps, or ledgers and scrolls that contained the bones of Europe's financial system. But some stories, always spoken in low voices, insisted it was something far older, something that had not been minted or written, but unearthed. The Templars had always claimed their greatest secret was not wealth, but wisdom. Back in Jerusalem, when they had lodged within the ruins of Solomon's temple, they had dug, night after night, year after year, into the bedrock. Most dismissed this as idle rumor, but the Order never denied it. And now, when their walls crumbled, the legend rose again like smoke. Had they taken relics from beneath the Holy of Holies? Was there truly a crown, a seal, or a fragment of the Ark itself among their holdings? Picture the scene. A hidden chamber in a remote Templar fortress, lit by only a handful of torches. A chest is dragged onto a stone floor, its iron bindings heavy with dust. The knights present do not count coins, they whisper prayers. Their hands tremble not from greed, but from the weight of what they believe they hold. In those hushed hours, they are not bankers or soldiers. They are guardians of a mystery. And so the question turned practical. How do you protect what cannot be replaced? A fortress can be stormed, a vault opened, but a secret, if carried by faithful men, can walk across mountains, sail across oceans, and outlive the fall of empires. Some chronicles hint at routes, from Paris down to the port of La Rochelle, from there to ships bound for Scotland, Portugal, or beyond. Others point to mountain monasteries where Templar sympathizers kept silent vigil. Each clue is faint, each trail dissolves in contradiction, but the idea remains constant, that the Order's true inheritance was spirited away before the Vatican could lay a hand on it. Yet even here danger pressed in. A treasure this great was not protected only by swords. It demanded silence, discipline, trust. And those were the very qualities being eaten alive by fear. For every knight sworn to secrecy, another whispered in shadows to save his own skin. The treasure of Solomon, or the myth of it, was no longer simply a legacy. It had become a test of whether the Order could remain one brotherhood or whether it would break apart under the weight of its own secrets. In many ways, this was the true battle. Not in the squares where flames rose, but in the quiet roads at night. In the locked halls where decisions were made about what to carry and who could be trusted to carry it. And though we cannot trace every step, the fact remains. When the Vatican stretched out its hand, much of what it sought was already gone. When fire consumed their halls and chains closed around their leaders, the Order did not vanish overnight. Instead, it fractured, like glass struck by a hammer, shards flying in every direction. Some broke quietly, dissolving into ordinary life, hiding their mantles under plain cloth. But others carried something heavier, not just memory, but responsibility. The routes of escape became myths of their own. Chroniclers speak of La Rochelle, the great port on France's western coast. On the eve of the arrests, the harbor was filled with Templar ships. By the next morning, they were gone. No wreckage was ever found. Did they flee north to Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated and desperate for allies, might have welcomed them? Or did their sails carry them further, down into Iberia, where Portugal, young, ambitious, and eager for guardians, would soon foster the birth of a new order, the Knights of Christ? Legends grew bolder still. Some insisted the ships crossed the Atlantic itself, centuries before Columbus. They spoke of strange markings on early maps, of oak trees carved with crosses, of whispers among tribes that pale warriors once came from the sea. Historians may scoff, yet the persistence of the tale suggests something was carried westward. If not men, then at least their story. But let's return to Europe for a moment. Scotland's glens are still heavy with the rumor that Templar knights fought alongside Bruce at Bannockburn, their lances breaking English lines when all seemed lost. Whether true or not, the story gave birth to a new kind of myth. The idea that the Templars had not simply survived, but had chosen their ground carefully, aligning themselves with powers that defied Rome. In Iberia, their survival is better documented. There, the Pope's decrees were acknowledged, but monarchs hesitated to destroy warriors who still had skill and ships. The name Templar was forbidden, but the Knights of Christ emerged in Portugal, carrying the same discipline, the same vows, even many of the same men. And under their banners, voyages of discovery would later set sail, voyages that would redraw the world. What became of the treasure? Some believe it was absorbed into these new orders, fueling expansion and empire. Others whisper it was hidden, buried deep in vaults no pope or king could breach. Castles in Spain still show sealed tunnels, doorways carved with crosses that lead nowhere. Perhaps nowhere to us, but somewhere to those who knew the paths. And here lies the brilliance of the legend. The treasure, whether of gold or of Solomon's wisdom, ceased to be a thing. It became an idea strong enough to inspire secret societies, revolutionaries, explorers, and storytellers for centuries after. The Vatican could burn bodies, kings could seize land. But once the Templars became fugitives, their myth could no longer be controlled. It slipped the net. It sailed with the ships. It lingered in every place where men dared whisper, "Perhaps the treasure is still out there." And that whisper was more dangerous than any sword. In Rome, the dungeons grew quiet after the trials. Parchments had been signed, bulls had been issued, and bonfires had swallowed both men and memory. On paper, the order of the temple was gone. Yet rumors do not die as easily as bodies. Reports trickled into the Vatican, carried by bishops and spies, sightings of men in white mantles fighting under other banners, strange ships bearing the old red cross docking in hidden harbors, whispers in markets that the Templars had not only escaped, but carried something with them. What troubled the Curia most was not the possibility of treasure. It was the persistence of loyalty. Pilgrims still told stories of brave knights who had protected them on roads to Jerusalem. Farmers swore their fathers owed debts to the temple's fairness, not to its greed. In some places, peasants left candles burning at ruined chapels, as if the order were saints rather than heretics. The Vatican had hoped that the confessions, extracted under fire and iron, would destroy the knight's reputation. Instead, people began to doubt the very machinery of Rome. If they were guilty, one chronicler noted bitterly, why do the people still whisper their names in prayer? This dissonance grew sharper when kings themselves hesitated. Portugal had not destroyed the Templars. Instead, they simply changed their name. Scotland openly defied Rome, offering rumors of safe haven. Even within France, where Philip's iron hand had struck hardest, families quietly hid documents, relics, and sometimes even men who had once served the temple. And so, in Rome's marble halls, a fear began to take root, not of armies or castles, but of shadows. The Templars had become something worse than an enemy. They had become an idea. It is said that one cardinal, upon hearing that peasants still prayed at a burned preceptory, slammed his hand on the table and muttered, "We cut off the head, but the ghost will not fall." From this fear grew a subtle strategy. If the order could not be killed, perhaps their memory could be twisted. Chroniclers loyal to the Curia began to emphasize tales of greed, of blasphemous rituals, of obscene feasts in underground halls. They painted the knights as demons wearing armor, men whose downfall was not injustice but divine punishment. But the more they tried to bury the truth beneath slander, the more fascination grew. Because people are not drawn to saints as much as they are drawn to sinners redeemed, or martyrs wronged. And in the figure of the Templars, many began to see not heretics, but victims of power. It was a dangerous shift. Rome feared it. Kings feared it. For if the order lived on in loyalty and legend, then perhaps they lived on in other ways too, in hidden vaults, secret rites, or worse still, in alliances no one dared name aloud. And from this fear emerged a darker question, one that would haunt the papacy for generations. Had their attempt to destroy the Templars actually unleashed something far more uncontrollable? Whispers spread fastest in the silence of fear. By the time they reached the taverns of Paris and the cloisters of Rome, the story had changed a dozen times. Some said the Templars had hidden treasure beneath mountains. Others swore they had carried relics east across the sea. But there was one rumor that made even the most pious men cross themselves twice. The Templars had not been abandoned by God. They had turned to his enemy. It began with a single parchment, discovered in a monastery in Burgundy. The document, so the tale went, described a meeting in which certain Templar masters had invoked a shadowed figure, binding themselves by an oath sealed not in wax, but in blood. The name scratched into the margin was Baphomet. To the frightened and the curious alike, this was no mere heresy. It was a pact. The Vatican had long used this accusation in trials, but now it returned like a serpent eating its own tail. Because the people did not ask, were they guilty? Instead, they asked, what if it was true? Merchants in Marseille claimed ships bearing the Red Cross had sailed under moonless skies, carrying priests who whispered invocations to the deep. In Germany, peasants swore they saw cloaked figures by ruined churches, chanting under stars that seemed too bright to be natural. Every story fed the next, until the Templars' legacy was no longer just of knights and swords, but of sorcery and forbidden covenants. The irony was brutal. Rome had once accused them to break them. Now that very slander gave them power in legend, an aura darker and more enduring than gold. For men fear gold thieves, but they tremble before those who speak with devils. In secret chambers, Vatican scribes debated whether to suppress these rumors or to amplify them. Suppression risked admitting the order might still exist. Amplification risked inflaming fascination, turning the knights into symbols of rebellion against papal authority. Either choice carried danger. But beneath the politics, there was something more unsettling. A few whispered even within the Curia that some documents confiscated from the temple had never been released. that inside those parchments lay rites, symbols, even seals that did not look entirely human in design. Imagine the unease of a young monk, tasked with copying these forbidden texts by candlelight, tracing sigils that seemed to writhe under his quill. Imagine his heartbeat when he realized these were not the inventions of frightened men, but instructions, rituals, invocations, formulas. And so the rumor hardened into something closer to belief. The order had not simply fallen, it had transformed. Cast out by the Pope, betrayed by the crown, they had turned to a new patron. And if that was true, then the Iron Seal, the whispered pact between throne, tiara, and something darker, was not a metaphor at all, but a contract. Whispers, once unleashed, rarely die. In Rome, the rumors about the Templars twisted into knives. They were repeated not as idle gossip, but as weapons, slipped into the ears of cardinals, whispered behind cloistered doors, carried in letters sealed with wax that melted under too many hands. The Vatican was never a monolith. Beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's and the ringing of bells, factions had always vied for power, some loyal to the Pope, others to the crown of France, still others to hidden patrons whose names were never spoken aloud. The story of the Templars' supposed pact with the devil gave each side a tool sharp enough to cut through centuries of tradition. One faction saw opportunity. If the Knights truly held secrets darker than Scripture, then those secrets could be wielded. Why destroy, they argued in hushed councils, what could be bent to serve the Church? Another faction recoiled in horror, insisting that even to consider such things was to damn Rome itself. And so the cracks widened, not over faith, but over fear. Letters survive, fragmentary, half-burned, tucked into the archives. One from a French cardinal reads, "We have in our grasp the very key to bend nations. The Templars knew it, and now so may we." Another, unsigned but marked with a strange spiral seal, warns, "What was once chained must never be unbound. Already shadows gather in the halls." It wasn't long before informants crept into the Pope's own household. Servants who poured wine at banquets were quietly paid to repeat what they heard. Priests in confession betrayed the sanctity of the booth, relaying penances straight to royal ears. Even the Pope's chamberlain was accused of copying forbidden documents in the dead of night. The betrayal was not always grand. Sometimes it was a slip of parchment, sometimes a glance across a crowded chapel. But like drops of water on stone, they wore down trust until the Vatican itself felt hollow. Imagine the weight of being Pope Clement, walking through candlelit corridors where every shadow might hide an enemy, not just outside, but within. To his right, advisors urging him to embrace these rumors, to twist them for Rome's advantage. To his left, men warning that even a whisper of indulgence would unleash something uncontrollable. And above it all hung the unspoken fear. What if the pact wasn't rumor at all? What if, in seeking to exploit the shadows, the Church itself had already stepped into them? By the end of that year, the Vatican was no longer a fortress of unity. It was a labyrinth of secrets, betrayals, and half-truths, each corridor echoing with footsteps that might belong to friend or foe. The Iron Seal, whether real or imagined, had done its work. The Templars were gone, yet their shadow ruled Rome. The year was heavy with silence, a silence that felt staged, as though Rome itself held its breath. The great basilicas still rang with hymns, incense still curled upward in shafts of light, but beneath the stone floors, something else stirred. After the fall of the Templars, their properties had been seized, their commanderies stripped of banners, and their treasuries looted. Yet what mattered most was not the gold, nor the land. It was the rumor of their secrets, the ones the trials had whispered of. To many, these secrets were lies invented under torture. To others, they were the one true prize. Inside the Vatican, a new council was called, not a public synod, but a private chamber meeting sealed from the outside world. Only a handful of cardinals, scribes sworn to silence, and the Pope himself knew of it. The official reason: to decide how to distribute the Templar estates. The hidden reason: to ask whether something had been left behind. They called it the question of the seal. Some argued it was merely superstition, that there was no iron seal, no pact, no crown or key hidden in the ashes of the order. But others leaned forward, their voices low, claiming fragments of testimony, strange confessions, even markings found etched in stone at dissolved commanderies. Why erase them entirely, one cardinal asked, if their ruin was already ensured? Why the urgency? Why the need for flames in Paris, when silence would have buried them just as well? The chamber was divided. On one side, those who wanted to put the past to rest, to close the book on the Templars before it consumed Rome. On the other, those who believed the Church could not afford to ignore what might be true. From these arguments came whispers of rituals. If the Templars had indeed made a pact, then perhaps the only way to guard against it, or to seize its power, was to mirror it. To recreate in controlled shadows what the Knights had once done in reckless secrecy. Imagine that chamber. Walls draped with crimson, torches sputtering against damp stone. The Pope seated in silence as voices clashed around him. Some demanded purity, others demanded action. And Clement, ever cautious, let the silence grow until even the bravest cardinal dared not speak. What choice could he make? To deny the pact entirely was to risk letting others, kings, rivals, heretics, chase its phantom without Rome's oversight. To pursue it was to admit the Church itself would step into forbidden ground. And so the Pope gave no answer that night. Instead, he dismissed the council with a simple phrase recorded only in one scribe's trembling hand. "We will see who comes knocking." That phrase would echo for years, because it marked the first time the Vatican did not simply condemn the whispers. It let them linger, let them take root, as though testing whether the devil himself might indeed knock at Rome's door. Night in Rome had its own rhythm. Bells tolled, torches guttered, and pilgrims curled into doorways to sleep. Yet on certain nights, when the moon rode low and red over the Tiber, the Vatican's corridors did not rest. On one such night, the Pope's most trusted chamberlain carried a locked chest through a hidden passage beneath the apostolic palace. No guards marched at his side, only two silent clerics whose faces were hooded, their steps muffled by the ancient stones. The chest was said to contain remnants confiscated from Templar commanderies. Scraps of parchment, fragments of seals, and a small iron disc whose markings no one had dared to read aloud. At the far end of the passage lay a door few living men had ever seen. It opened into a crypt older than the basilica itself, a place built on top of Roman ruins, where pagan altars had once stood. Here, in the dim light of oil lamps, a circle of cardinals waited. This was not a public council. This was something else. The ritual they attempted was not written in any liturgy. It was pieced together from Templar confessions, from fragments said to describe oaths sworn in shadows. Each participant carried a candle of blackened wax. The Pope himself did not preside. His absence was deliberate, a shield of plausible denial, but his sanction was whispered to have been given with a nod. They placed the iron seal on a stone table. The disc pulsed faintly in the lamplight, though it gave no glow of its own. Carved into its face was a serpent coiled into a crown, its mouth biting its own tail. One by one, the cardinals laid their right hands upon it. One by one, they recited words that sounded less like Latin and more like something far older, syllables carried from the East, perhaps learned by knights who had dug too deeply under Solomon's temple. As the last voice fell silent, the lamps flickered. Some swore the air itself grew heavier, as if pressed down by unseen weight. One scribe noted that the serpent engraving seemed to shimmer, its eye catching light where no light touched it. Another claimed he heard the faint hiss of breath, though no one in the chamber moved. Then the candle flames surged high, nearly snuffing out. The clerics staggered back, crossing themselves, while one of the cardinals collapsed to his knees. He cried that he saw a figure standing at the far edge of the chamber, tall, cloaked, and watching. The others denied it, insisting he had fainted from fasting and fear. But his scream was written into the secret record. It comes when called. The ritual ended as abruptly as it began. The iron seal was locked back into the chest, the lamps doused, and the cardinals dispersed in silence. No blessing was spoken, no record was made, save for one trembling note that found its way into the margins of a Vatican archive. We sought only to prove it was empty, but emptiness does not breathe. From that night forward, the Vatican's relationship with the whispers of the Templars changed. They no longer spoke of them as lies. They spoke of them as dangers, and dangers must be guarded, not destroyed. Rumors are like smoke. They slip through cracks no matter how tightly doors are sealed. The Vatican's chamber that night had been locked, the candles extinguished, the chest sealed again under layers of wax and sigils. Yet within weeks, whispers leaked into the streets of Rome. Some said a circle of cardinals had called upon spirits in the old Roman crypts. Others claimed the Pope himself had touched a relic taken from the Templars. The most daring rumor suggested that the Iron Seal was not just a Templar artifact, but a key, forged in secret, to summon powers no priest should wield. Merchants on the Tiber began telling stories to travelers, that the Pope had made a pact with something he could not control. In taverns, sailors swore they saw red fire on the roof of St. Peter's on the night of the ritual. Pilgrims whispered that strange hisses echoed through the basilica at midnight, as though snakes coiled unseen beneath the stones. Most citizens dismissed it as gossip. But beyond Rome, the rumors took root in darker soil. In Avignon, a scholar tied to the French court wrote in a private letter, "The Holy Father dabbles in things meant for sorcerers. If the Templars were guilty of this, then who taught them, and who now continues their rites?" In Florence, rival bankers began to spread the tale more deliberately. For them, it was useful to tarnish papal trust while competing for influence. They painted the Pope as a man willing to bargain with devils if it kept the Church's coffers full. And in Germany, wandering preachers seized upon the rumors to stir crowds. They warned of a Rome corrupted not just by greed, but by sorcery. Their sermons echoed across town squares. "Beware the shepherd who whispers to serpents." Inside the Vatican, panic quietly bloomed. Not all the cardinals had agreed to the ritual. Some who had stayed away now used the gossip as a weapon. They questioned why their brothers had descended into the crypt at all. They demanded explanations that could never safely be given. And so, secrecy began to tear at the Church from within. The Pope tried to smother the fire. He issued decrees condemning sorcery, doubled the sermons about purity, and staged public masses where he appeared more radiant than ever. But in the shadows, even his allies asked themselves, had they seen him hesitate during prayer? Had they noticed his gaze wander when the name of Christ was spoken? The most loyal defenders insisted these doubts were blasphemous. Yet doubt, once born, is harder to silence than open rebellion. And somewhere, hidden in a vault beneath the apostolic palace, the iron seal lay wrapped in silk and chained to stone. None dared touch it again. None dared destroy it either. Because deep down, every man who had stood in that chamber remembered the same thing. The way the lamps had flared, the weight in the air, the hiss that did not belong. They did not say it aloud, but they all knew. Whatever pact had been tested that night, it had not ended. If rumor was smoke, then France became the wind that fanned it into flame. King Philip's court had long been suspicious of Clement. After all, Clement owed his throne of St. Peter to French pressure. He was crowned pope in Lyon, not Rome, a humiliation still muttered about in hushed tones. To many French courtiers, Clement was their creature. And yet, he had shown an unsettling independence, shifting loyalties like a fox darting between hounds. The whispers of sorcery were too useful to ignore. Philip's advisors seized them like weapons newly forged. If the Pope could be painted as a man tainted by heresy, then his enemies could weaken him without drawing swords. Letters began to circulate, discreet but deliberate. From Avignon to Paris, from Paris to Burgundy, the same words reappeared. The Pope keeps an object stolen from the Templars. With it, he binds powers unclean. It was subtle at first. Courtiers mentioned it at banquets, bishops hinted at it in sermons. Then, more openly, pamphlets emerged, anonymous but clearly sponsored, warning that Rome's shepherd had traded the crozier for a serpent's staff. Philip himself remained silent, but he allowed his agents to speak loudly enough. Silence is its own consent. In the countryside, the effect was electric. Peasants who once only half believed in Rome now began to mutter openly. Why else had the Templars been crushed, except that they had shared their corruption with the Pope himself? If knights in white mantles had been burned for witchcraft, why not the man who sat in the Lateran? In German lands, the rumors met fertile ground among reformist preachers who already railed against papal greed. They warned that Rome was no longer the city of Peter, but Babylon reborn. And the beast with iron mark shall speak in secret, one itinerant friar declared, pointing not to Scripture, but to the stories flooding in from France. Clement fought back with paper. Bulls were issued condemning false tongues and malicious tongues. Threats of excommunication hurled at those who dared repeat the slander. But the irony was plain. The harder Rome protested, the more certain people became that something had been hidden. Inside the College of Cardinals, the division sharpened. Some whispered that Clement had been reckless, that even allowing such a ritual had been a sin beyond forgiveness. Others, more pragmatic, argued that it had been necessary, an attempt to bind the Church more tightly to its destiny. But in the corridors of power, doubt is poison. Every council meeting became a test of loyalty. Every silence was a confession. And in France, a darker thought began to take root. If Clement was tainted, perhaps he could be replaced. A pope accused of sorcery was not just vulnerable, he was expendable. The irony was sharp as a blade. Clement had once thought to use the iron seal to strengthen his rule. Now the seal itself had become the whisper of his undoing. You know, when most people picture the end of the Templars, they imagine everything burning away in Paris. Records gone, knights arrested, treasure vanished. but endings are rarely that neat. If you were standing on a Mediterranean dock in the early 1300s, you might have seen something quieter, less dramatic, but far more dangerous. Parchment folded into oilskin, charts marked with strange little sigils, bundles of letters sealed not with wax, but with a pressed iron stamp. These weren't treasure chests, they were instructions, routes, codes, ways to move value without moving a single coin. To the average dock worker, they looked like boring cargo manifests. To those who knew, they were lifelines. Imagine running your fingers along one of those old porcelain maps. You'd see jagged coastlines inked in red, compass roses scattered across the parchment like stars, and tiny notes scribbled in margins. But hidden among them were marks you wouldn't recognize. A serpent's crown carved so faintly into the vellum it only appeared when light hit it at the right angle. That wasn't decoration. That was a signal. This ship is safe. This message can be trusted. And here's the twist. Long after the trials in Paris, these documents kept appearing in far-off ports. Valencia, Porto, Bruges, places where the Templars were supposed to be finished. Every mark was like a ghost signature, proof that their networks had slipped under the surface and survived. So the question is, did they scatter just to save themselves? Or were they planting seeds, setting up something that could outlast any king's fury? And that's where we'll go next. Following those seeds to Portugal, where an order with a different name but the same blood quietly picked up the tools of navigation and finance, carrying the iron seal across oceans. Picture this. France has slammed its gates on the Templars. The Pope has branded them heretics. But if you sail a little further south, to the rugged coastline of Portugal, you'll notice something strange. Instead of erasing the Templar cross, the king there chose to repaint it. In 1319, King Dinas, an unusually shrewd monarch, walked a dangerous tightrope. On one hand, he couldn't openly defy the Vatican. On the other, he knew Portugal owed much of its frontier defense, its roads, even its early ships, to Templar hands. So he crafted a loophole. The Templars were officially dissolved, yes, but overnight, a new group was born. The Order of Christ. Same castles, same lands, same knights. The name changed, but the spirit lived on. If you stood inside Tomar, the old Templar stronghold, you would have seen it clearly. The fortress didn't fall into ruin. Instead, the banners changed colors, the seals were recarved, and the iron seal itself, yes, that symbol we've been chasing, was pressed again, now hidden behind a more acceptable Christian facade. And here's where it gets fascinating. The Order of Christ didn't just survive. They thrived. They became the backbone of Portugal's age of discovery. Think about the ships that crossed into the Atlantic, that hugged the coasts of Africa, that dared to slip into waters no European had charted before. Almost every one of them sailed under sails marked with a red cross, not the papal cross, but the cross of the Order of Christ. The Vatican may have thought they buried the Templars in Paris, but the truth? They had just given them new sails, new oceans, and a new destiny. Now pause for a second. What does that mean for our story? It means the Pact of the Iron Seal, the whispers of forbidden knowledge, and the networks scattered across Europe didn't die in the fire. They simply put on a new mask. And in Portugal, that mask would eventually steer caravels across the edge of the known world. Have you ever wondered how Portugal, a small, rugged kingdom on the edge of Europe, suddenly leapt ahead of every other nation in exploration? Was it luck? Was it faith? Or was it something more carefully guarded? The Order of Christ reborn from the ashes of the Templars, didn't just keep their swords sharp. They kept their maps. And not just any maps. The kind whispered about in dark chambers, sketched from merchants, travelers, and perhaps even older scrolls said to trace back to Jerusalem and beyond. Inside Tomar, behind walls that once held Templar councils, new rooms were built. By day they looked like libraries, filled with parchment and compasses. By night, they became something else, laboratories of navigation. Monks and knights bent over charts lit by flickering oil lamps, debating wind currents, tides, and stars. Some said they spoke of lands across the ocean, long before Columbus would ever dream of them. And think about this. The Red Cross of the Order of Christ became more than a religious symbol. It was a code, a banner under which ships carried not just goods, but secrets. Every voyage out of Lisbon and Porto was another chance to test what only a few men knew, that the world was far larger than most dared to admit. The Vatican, officially, blessed these expeditions. After all, spreading Christianity by sea sounded noble, but beneath the sails, wasn't there also the shadow of the Iron Seal? The same pact that once tied popes to forbidden power now rode the waves, disguised as exploration. Imagine standing at the dock as one of those ships pulled away. The crowd would cheer, priests would bless the crew. But hidden in the captain's chest, wrapped in wax seals and linen, might be a chart inked with symbols no one outside the order was meant to see. A chart not of the world as it was, but as it could be. And here's the twist. Many later chroniclers hinted that Portugal's leap into the Atlantic wasn't just daring, it was guided by knowledge too advanced for the time, too precise to be guessed. Knowledge the Order of Christ inherited, and perhaps never fully revealed. So the question we're left with is this. Were these men explorers, or custodians of a map far older than their ships, one perhaps drawn in the very days of Solomon's Temple? Picture this. The year is 1420. The air along the Portuguese coast is thick with salt and mist, the kind that clings to your skin. Fishermen tell stories of waters that pull ships farther west than intended, of shadows on the horizon that vanish when you chase them. Most dismiss these tales as tricks of the sea. But not the Order of Christ. They had heard whispers, old records smuggled from the ruins of Templar vaults, scraps of parchment inked with strange coastlines, and notes about currents flowing endlessly westward. To ordinary sailors, it was madness. To the heirs of the Templars, it was an invitation. So, under the cover of night, a handful of ships left the port of Lagos, no grand announcement, no royal fanfare, just sails marked with the Red Cross and captains sworn to silence. Their destination? Officially, to test the winds. Unofficially, to see if the whispers were true. That land lay waiting beyond the horizon. Imagine being on deck, staring into an endless expanse of black water, guided only by the stars. The crew would hear nothing but the creak of wood and the slap of waves. Days stretched into weeks. Men grew restless. Some swore they heard voices in the wind, like chants carried from a forgotten shore. Then, one night, the lookout claimed to see it. A faint line, darker than the sea, where the sky touched something solid. The next morning, the horizon was empty again. Was it a mirage? Or had they glimpsed what centuries later would be called the New World? When the ships returned, their logs were brief, almost deliberately vague. Strange currents, unknown birds, fragments of driftwood not native to these waters. Enough to spark curiosity, but not enough to prove anything. And yet, in Tomar, Behind the thick stone walls of the order, those notes were locked away, added to a collection that was never meant for the public eye. So here's the puzzle. Did the Templars, or their successors, sail west long before Columbus? Were they mapping secrets the Vatican could not control? Or were they chasing phantoms, leaving us with nothing but whispers carried by the Atlantic winds? When the first voyages ended, skeptics laughed. If there was land out there, they said, the Romans would have found it long ago. But the Order of Christ kept their silence because they had something the skeptics did not. Evidence. One morning, a battered ship limped back into Lisbon. Its hull was scarred, its sails torn, but what it carried sparked endless questions. On the deck lay a piece of driftwood, carved, polished, shaped by human hands. Not Portuguese, not Moorish, and certainly not from anywhere in Europe. The sailors swore they had pulled it from the ocean, hundreds of miles west, where no maps dared to reach. In Tamar, the Grand Master examined the relic. Some say he traced his finger along its grooves and whispered a prayer, as if recognizing a symbol older than any kingdom. Soon after, the driftwood was locked away in the archives, filed under evidence of distant shores. But that wasn't all. Sailors returned with stories of birds, strange ones, larger and with cries unlike any in Europe, that followed their ships for days before vanishing into the western fog. Some claimed they even found seeds tangled in nets, seeds that refused to sprout in European soil. And here's where the whispers grew louder. In remote villages along Portugal's coast, crosses began to appear, etched into stone, carved into old beams of fishing huts. Not the Latin cross, not the Greek one, but a strange hybrid. Curved arms, almost serpentine, echoing symbols the Templars once guarded in Jerusalem. Coincidence? Or a breadcrumb trail left behind by men who had seen something too dangerous, too sacred to speak aloud? The Vatican, of course, would never admit it. For Rome, the discovery of new lands had to come under the banner of the Church, not through secret voyages by an order it had once condemned. So the records were sealed, and the driftwood, if it still exists, remains hidden in some dark chamber, waiting for a day when the truth no longer threatens power. So I'll ask you this. What do you believe? Was the driftwood just a curiosity, washed across oceans by chance? Or was it a silent witness, proof that the Red Cross touched new shores long before Columbus ever raised his sails? If driftwood and strange seeds could be dismissed as curiosities, maps could not. Maps were power, and in the 15th century, power over the seas meant power over the future. In the monastery at Tomar, whispers told of scrolls locked away in a chest bound with iron. They weren't ordinary charts. These maps showed coastlines no European had officially set eyes on, jagged inlets, river mouths, and entire stretches of land across the Western Ocean. How could such detail exist centuries before Columbus? Sailors who served under the order claimed they had seen copies, faded ink drawings smuggled from the vaults by monks sympathetic to their cause. One described a land where rivers flowed so wide they seemed like seas, and where forests stretched endlessly, filled with birds unlike any in Europe. Another swore he had seen symbols on the map that matched Templar seals, tiny red crosses inked beside harbors that no chronicler dared name. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. When word of these forbidden maps leaked, the Vatican acted swiftly. Certain monks disappeared. Scribes were accused of heresy, and in the margins of official chronicles, one finds cryptic notes scratched out, terrae ignotae, the unknown lands, followed by lines of ink violently crossed through, as if truth itself had to be buried. Imagine for a moment being a young sailor in Lisbon. You're told the world ends at the horizon, yet a fellow seaman slips you a fragment of parchment showing lands across the sea. Would you laugh? Or would you lie awake at night, staring westward, wondering if destiny waited beyond the waves? Historians today dismiss such tales, calling them exaggerations of medieval imagination. But maps don't lie. And if even a single one survived the Vatican's purge, hidden in the vaults of Tomar or Rome, then the story of the Age of Discovery would need to be rewritten. Because perhaps it wasn't Columbus who first dared to dream of the New World. Perhaps it was the heirs of the Templars, the knights turned navigators, who carried those dreams across the ocean, centuries ahead of history's official script. In Rome, silence was never an accident. The Vatican thrived on records, papal bulls, decrees, letters sealed with wax. Every secret usually left a paper trail. Yet when it came to whispers of strange maps and voyages westward, the trail dissolved into smoke. Some say Pope Nicholas V himself had seen fragments, scrolls brought by merchants, copied from sailors' charts, and traced back to the old Templar stronghold at Tomar. The reports spoke of lands across the sea, rich in timber and rivers, lands that could tilt the balance of power in Christendom. But instead of being celebrated, these findings were locked away. Why? Because for the Vatican, knowledge was leverage. If Europe learned that the Knights of Christ, the Templars' heirs, were already exploring unknown worlds, it would mean acknowledging the Order's survival. Worse, it would mean that the Church had failed to destroy them completely in 1307. To admit such a truth would weaken Rome's grip. So the Church responded not with proclamations, but with silence. Monks who asked questions were reassigned to distant abbeys. Chroniclers who scribbled notes about Western lands saw their manuscripts vanish. An invisible hand seemed to sweep across Europe, erasing evidence before it could spark curiosity. Yet silence has a sound of its own. Rumors spread anyway. Sailors returning from Lisbon spoke of maps that no cartographer in Rome dared admit existed. Merchants whispered of papal envoys who had quietly purchased copies, only to disappear on their way back to the Vatican. And in the diaries of a certain Florentine scholar, still preserved today, one chilling line stands out. Rome knows more than she dares confess. The sea will reveal what the pen is forbidden to write. Imagine that. A church that preached truth, yet buried it under layers of ink and shadows. And for those who sat in Rome's marble halls, the silence was not only a strategy, it was survival. Because if the world discovered that the Templars, in some form, had beaten every explorer to the New World, what else might people begin to question about the Church's version of history? If you walked into a scriptorium in the 15th century, you would hear the soft scratch of quills on parchment. Rows of monks bent over their desks, copying texts with steady patience. But behind the calm discipline, another kind of work was happening: erasure. The Vatican did not burn every map or manuscript it found suspicious. Fire was too obvious, too noisy. Instead, it favored a quieter weapon: censorship disguised as preservation. A chronicler might be instructed to correct a mistake on a map by removing an unfamiliar coastline. A scribe might be told to update a text, cutting out passages that hinted at lands beyond the known seas. The new copy would then replace the old, while the original quietly disappeared into a chest no one outside the curia would ever open again. Whole libraries were sifted this way. The Church's Index of Forbidden Books, which many people think of as a 16th century invention, had its roots much earlier. The goal was never just to protect faith, It was to control curiosity. And curiosity, when it came to the legacy of the Templars, was dangerous. Consider this. In the records of the University of Salamanca, a professor once wrote of navigations accomplished by the Order of Christ that predate the voyages of Genoese sailors. That line no longer exists in the university's archives, but fragments of the professor's lecture notes survive, tucked into the private collection of a noble family. Was it an exaggeration? Perhaps. But if the Vatican truly believed it to be harmless fantasy, why go to the trouble of erasing it? Travelers noticed the gaps too. An Italian merchant who passed through Portugal wrote that maps he saw in Lisbon showed rivers and coastlines unknown to any Roman atlas. Yet when he tried to buy one, he was told such charts had been recalled by order of the Church. Within a year, his diary was confiscated. It was not just maps, sermons, plays, even tavern songs that joked about Templar sailors crossing into God's sunset lands were forbidden. The Vatican understood something modern people often forget. Stories spread faster than facts. To kill a story, you had to smother every version of it. And yet, suppression often backfires. When people are told not to look at something, their desire only grows sharper. The censored maps became treasures whispered about in secret. The confiscated books were copied in hidden corners. And the silence of Rome, once meant to cover up the truth, began to sound like proof that the truth was real. One cannot help but wonder, did the Church realize that by tightening its grip, it was only feeding the myth? History is full of things that slip through the cracks, fragments that survive not because they were meant to, but because someone, somewhere, refused to let them go. In Lisbon's harbor taverns during the late 15th century, sailors would speak of islands not marked by Rome, places described in songs and family tales. Many laughed them off as drunken inventions, yet the stories refused to die. Fishermen returned from voyages claiming to have seen strange birds, unknown fruits, and carved stones along western currents. Nothing they said could be proven, but neither could it be silenced. And then there were the navigators, men like Columbus, Vespucci, and Cabral, whose voyages carried echoes of something older. Columbus, in particular, carried a set of charts whose origin remains mysterious. His son later wrote that his father believed others had gone before him, though he never dared to say who. Some historians suspect these were refinements of Templar maps passed down through Portugal's Order of Christ, disguised under layers of correction. A curious clue lies in the names. Why did Columbus call one Caribbean island Santa Maria de la Concepción? Why did early Portuguese explorers baptize new lands with names tied to obscure saints linked to crusading orders? It was almost as if they were leaving breadcrumbs, a quiet acknowledgement that their footsteps were not the first on those shores. Letters from merchants also hint at something strange. In Florence, a banker wrote to his colleague in Bruges, "The Portuguese do not sail blindly. Their ships go where their fathers' books already pointed." The letter was carefully phrased, almost coded, but the meaning is hard to miss. Exploration was less about discovery, more about unveiling. Even in Spain, where the Inquisition kept a close eye, rumors persisted. Priests warned their flocks not to believe tales of Templar pilots guiding ships across the Western Ocean. But warnings have a way of keeping curiosity alive. By the time the age of discovery exploded, half of Europe already believed someone had crossed, long before Columbus's sails caught the wind. What fascinates me most is how these whispers weren't just tolerated. They became fuel. For men who risked their lives chasing horizons, it was easier to sail into the unknown, if they believed someone had done it first. Even a rumor of Templar voyages could steady the nerves of sailors who otherwise might never leave sight of land. So in a strange way, the Vatican's silence, the censorship, the erasures, they all backfired. By trying to bury the whispers, Rome gave them a second life, and those whispers carried ships across the Atlantic. Every legend has a moment where it sharpens into a question. What if it wasn't a legend at all? By the 16th century, Europe was roaring with change, empires rising on the waves, gold flowing from across the Atlantic, the church entangled in politics heavier than scripture. And in the shadows of this new world, the old whispers of the Templars began to surface again. Hidden in the archives of Avignon, a French historian stumbled upon a fragment of parchment sealed with an iron emblem. The symbol was unmistakable, a serpent curling around a cross, pressed into blackened wax. The document itself was mundane, a list of trade permissions. But at the bottom was a note that chilled him. By the seal we endure, by the seal we obey. What seal? No ordinary papal insignia bore that mark. No Christian bishop would dare set a serpent at the foot of the cross. Yet there it was, a relic of something unsanctioned, hidden in plain sight. Other fragments told similar stories. In Rome, a Dominican inquisitor complained in his letters about seamen who carry maps more trusted than God, swearing their charts descend from a pact never confessed. In Lisbon, a cathedral register noted strange donations made by ship captains, golden coins stamped not with royal crests, but with crude engravings of intertwined keys and serpents. Could these be coincidences? Of course. Historians will tell you there are always symbols, always misreadings. But when patterns keep resurfacing in places where the Church tried hardest to silence them, you can't help but wonder. The Vatican certainly did. Several popes issued quiet orders for archivists to comb through records, remove suspect seals, and burn anything that could be mistaken for heresy. But here's the irony. The harder they tried to erase the traces, the clearer the outline became. A shadow is sharpest when cast against the brightest flame. And so the question lingered. Was there once a pact, an agreement made not in daylight, but in the trembling hours of midnight, between the Church and the very men it once condemned? A pact bound not by paper and ink, but by something far more dangerous, the seal of iron. If such a pact existed, it could explain the unexplainable. Why did certain voyages succeed against impossible odds? Why did maps appear centuries before explorers claimed discovery? Why did the Church, sworn to crush Templar heresy, quietly protect fragments of their legacy? The echo of that seal is faint, but if you lean close enough, into the stories, into the silences, it feels almost like a heartbeat. The Vatican has always been a master of silence. Where kings shouted from balconies and emperors carved their victories into stone, the Church often worked with a quieter tool, forgetting. But forgetting isn't natural. It has to be manufactured. In the years after the fragments of the Iron Seal were whispered about, patterns of deliberate erasure began to appear. Monks copying manuscripts would leave blank spaces where certain words should have been. Margins once filled with notes were scraped away, leaving pale scars on the parchment. And in court records, inquisitors condemned unholy pacts without ever naming them, as if even to write the word would give it power. One story comes from Toledo, Spain, where a scholar named Fray Alonso claimed to have traced a hidden lineage of maps marked with the serpent cross. He said these maps were used by navigators before Columbus, charting islands across the Western Sea. Weeks later, His library burned in what officials called an accident with lamps. Alonso himself was transferred to a remote monastery and never wrote again. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the Vatican archives carry hundreds of similar silences, names that vanish, titles of books mentioned once, then never again, seals cut out of wax tablets and replaced with blank round impressions, and always the serpent returns. In Florence, a banker's ledger from 1524 listed payments made to Knights beyond the Alps by order of the seal. No further explanation, just a transaction, hidden among mundane entries of grain and cloth. For ordinary people, these details meant nothing. The sermons never mentioned them. The bells rang as always. Faith continued. But in private, men in red robes debated. Should these echoes be smothered, or should they be guarded? Because here lies the paradox. If the seal truly existed, it wasn't just a threat. It might have been a tool, a bargain struck in desperation between a church facing enemies on every side and knights who refused to die. Imagine the weight of that choice. To admit the pact would be to confess heresy at the highest altar. To destroy it entirely might sever a lifeline to secrets older than Rome itself. So they chose the middle path. Silence. Erase enough to keep the world calm. Preserve enough to keep the option alive. And so the seal survived, not as a proclamation, but as a shadow, faint impressions on wax, whispered notes in margins, rumors that refused to die. But silence is never permanent. It only waits. And in the centuries that followed, the Iron Seal would find new voices, sailors, heretics, mystics, who claimed to have seen its mark and lived by its power. The Church tried to keep the world quiet, but in trying, it may have only made the whispers louder. Every time the Church tried to bury the seal, someone else seemed determined to dig it back up. Not kings, not bishops, but outsiders, those the Vatican called heretics. In the hills of southern France, the Cathars whispered of a crown and a serpent, a symbol of forbidden wisdom. To them, the seal wasn't the devil's mark, but a reminder that power could be wrestled away from corrupt priests. Their enemies in Rome branded this belief demonic. Armies marched, villages burned. Yet the whispers survived, carried in song, passed like a torch in secret meetings. Farther north, in the German lands, alchemists spoke of a pact between iron and breath. They scrawled sigils in margins, symbols strikingly similar to those found in the ruins of Templar strongholds. To them, the seal wasn't heresy. It was a formula, a promise that matter itself could bend under will. Many of these men were arrested, their manuscripts burned, but a few survived, fleeing to courts that prized knowledge more than dogma. And then there were the sailors. In Lisbon, Genoa, Bristol, harbors that smelled of salt and ambition, captains told tales of knights of the seal guiding ships across strange waters. Some claimed these knights carried relics blessed or cursed by the pact. Others said they wore rings that glowed faintly when the moon was high. Did they truly see such men? Or did fear of the unknown dress itself in old legends? The Church called them liars, the Inquisition hunted them. But history has a habit of keeping what cannot be erased. And even in condemnation, fragments of truth slip through. Think of it like this. When the hammer falls on an anvil, sparks fly. The seal was the anvil. Heresy, curiosity, desperation, those were the hammers. And every time they struck, something survived. A story, a symbol, a rumor. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine the Church in control, silencing all dissent. But the truth is murkier. In chasing the seal from the world, Rome only scattered it further. It became less a secret to hide and more a riddle to solve. And for those branded heretics, that riddle was worth their lives. Because what if the seal was not just myth? What if the pact was real and still waiting to be claimed? When the dust of crusades settled and the Templars were gone, the iron seal should have faded into memory. But it didn't. Instead, it slipped into the shadows, kept alive not by armies, but by brotherhoods. In Florence, a city bursting with art and ambition, whispers spread about a circle of men who met beneath the guild halls. They weren't priests or nobles. They were merchants, bankers, and scholars, men who understood that knowledge was more dangerous than any sword. Among them, a symbol appeared again and again, a serpent coiled around a crown, etched into ledgers, hidden in margins of books. North of the Alps, in Prague, another group claimed descent from the last Templars who fled execution. They called themselves the Custodes Ferrum, keepers of the iron. Their gatherings were said to take place by torchlight in ruined chapels, where the seal was drawn onto the floor in chalk and erased before dawn. Their vow was simple: protect the fragments of the pact until the world was ready. And in Portugal, the Knights of Christ, the order that rose from Templar ashes, hid symbols in their navigational charts. Some sailors swore those strange markings pointed to islands that appeared on no map, lands far beyond the reach of the Pope. Was it simply a code for routes and harbors? Or something more, a trail leading to where the seal itself had been carried? These brotherhoods never claimed the seal openly. They couldn't. To speak of it was to invite fire and rope. Instead, they wrapped it in ritual. They raised toasts to the breath of iron. They swore oaths by the serpent's crown. They told stories of how the seal could either enslave or liberate, depending on the hand that held it. For centuries, the Church called them liars, pagans, or worse. But here's the strange thing. Despite all the suppression, fragments of their traditions survived. A motto here, a carving there, a symbol slipped into stained glass. It's as though history itself refused to erase them completely. If you trace the line far enough, you begin to wonder, were these scattered groups just inventing legends to give themselves purpose? Or were they all protecting the same thing, a thread stretching back to the moment when the Pope himself made a pact he could never confess? And if that thread has lasted this long, maybe it hasn't yet snapped. Deep within the Vatican archives lies a door most visitors never see. Not the grand bronze gates or gilded chambers you see on guided tours, but a narrow, iron-banded door at the end of a forgotten corridor. Behind it, records say, there is a chamber known only to a handful of archivists, a place where documents too dangerous for the public are locked away. Among these, rumor insists, rests a single codex bound in black leather, its spine cracked but intact. On the cover, pressed into the hide, is a serpent biting its own tail. Archivists who have dared to whisper of it call it Liber Ferrum, the Book of Iron. What does it contain? Some say it's nothing more than a catalogue of heresies, a reminder of dangerous ideas long buried. Others believe it holds the original transcript of the Iron Seal itself, the very agreement between Pope Clement V and forces he could never admit to invoking. There are accounts, half-hidden in marginal notes of 17th-century scholars, that describe clerics being sent into the chamber and emerging pale, shaken, their faith fractured. A Jesuit once wrote cryptically that in the chamber of serpents lies a crown no man should wear. His letter was intercepted, sealed, and his name quietly erased from church rolls. Why keep such a book at all? If the seal was just a myth, Burning the record would have been the easy choice. Yet the Vatican kept it. Perhaps they feared destroying it would release what it bound. Or perhaps they needed it close, a reminder of a debt not yet paid. In whispers passed through generations of clerics, a prophecy clings to the seal, that one day it will resurface, and whoever claims it will decide not just the fate of the Church, but of Christendom itself. And so the Vatican watches. From age to age, popes come and go, but the iron-banded door remains. Some say it hasn't been opened in decades. Others claim it opens more often than anyone would dare imagine, always in the dead of night, always with torches carried low, as though the light itself feared what it might reveal. The question is this: if the Vatican truly holds the seal, are they its jailers or its masters? There is a saying, tucked away in the margins of an old Cistercian manuscript: when the seal breaks, so too shall the crown of Christendom. For centuries, few paid attention. To most scribes, it was a scrap of apocalyptic poetry, like so many that haunted medieval texts. But to those who studied the Templars, and to those within the Vatican who knew the whispers, it meant something more. The prophecy tied itself to the iron seal, describing not just its making, but its unmaking. It spoke of 7 generations of silence, of storms that would wash over empires, and of a time when the seal would surface again. Not in Rome, not in Paris, but across the sea. Some scholars believe it hinted at the New World, that the Templars, long before Columbus, had already carried fragments of their knowledge westward, leaving markers only the initiated could read. The Vatican, if it believed this prophecy, never admitted it. But the pattern is hard to ignore. Each time Europe trembled, plagues, reformations, revolutions, there were sudden, quiet movements in the Vatican's hidden chambers. Documents shifted, maps were copied, doors opened in the archives, always at night, always in silence. And here is the unsettling thought. Perhaps the seal was never destroyed. Perhaps it lies even now locked in iron, waiting for hands bold or foolish enough to lift it again. If that's true, then the Templars did not fail. Their covenant, whatever dark bargain it was, still hangs like a shadow over us all. Imagine it, a pact made in whispers, ink pressed into iron, still echoing across centuries. If one day it were revealed, if the seal were broken in public, would it shatter faith, or prove that the Church's greatest secret was also its oldest fear? That's where we leave it tonight. Not with answers, but with a question. Because history's deepest truths aren't always solved. They linger, like a faint breath on cold glass. So I'll ask you, what do you think? Was the iron seal real? Was it a pact with power divine or something darker? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, mysteries that slip between shadow and history, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this journey with others. The seal may remain hidden in Rome, but its story is now yours to carry.